My parents called a family meeting to tell me to quit my job. 10 people are in my aunt's living room. My mother had a prepared speech. My father has a particular expression he wears when he has decided something and is waiting for you to agree. They had been planning this for weeks, I found out later. The restaurant was struggling. My brother had moved away. My father had a health scare the year before. They had decided, together, with the quiet certainty of two people who have convinced themselves that love and obligation are the same thing, that I needed to come home. And they had invited 11 members of our extended family to witness it. I let my father finish. Then I opened my bag. I placed a cream envelope on the coffee table in front of him. Inside was a letter from the editor-in-chief of one of the largest lifestyle publications in the country, offering me the position of features editor, a role I had been working toward for 4 years, at a salary that was more than my parents had ever made combined. My father looked at the envelope. The room went very still. Before I tell you what happened next, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you are right now. Now let me take you back to the summer I turned 17, and a woman named Diane who handed me a red pen and said, "Edit everything twice, the second time for what you actually meant." My name is Anna. I'm 26 years old. My parents own a restaurant. Park Family Kitchen has been on the corner of Clement and 7th in San Francisco since before I was born. My father Richard came to this country at 24 with a culinary school diploma from Seoul and a recipe book he kept in a waterproof sleeve in his jacket pocket. My mother, Helen, worked the front of house for the first 6 years while she learned the neighborhood. They built the restaurant the way they built everything, slowly, carefully, with the understanding that what matters is built twice, once with your hands and once with the decisions you make about it. I grew up in that restaurant. Saturday mornings at the prep table, while my father broke down vegetables with the patience of someone who understood that size and uniformity were not decorative concerns. Sunday evenings rolling silver alongside my brother James, who was 2 years older and already calculating the most efficient system for napkins by the time he was 12. I knew the restaurant's rhythms before I knew how to do long division. The lunch rush, the mid-afternoon quiet, the particular smell of the kitchen at 5 o'clock when the dinner prep reached its fullest point, garlic, ginger, the specific heat of the wok, and the dining room filled with that low hum that means every table is occupied and nobody wants to leave. I loved it. That's the part I want you to understand before I tell you what my parents did with that love. My grandmother, Nana Pack, my father's mother, who has lived with us since I was 6, told me something when I was 12. She was shelling peas at the kitchen table, a task she had been doing every Thursday for 40 years, and I was sitting across from her doing my homework. She looked at me over her reading glasses and said, in Korean that I understood better than I spoke, "You have your father's hands, Anna. But your eyes go somewhere else." I didn't know what she meant. She said, "When you're in this room, you're thinking about something outside it. That's not wrong. That's just true. You should know about yourself." I was 12. I filed it away. The summer I was 17, I got an internship at the school paper. Then at a local food blog that I'd been reading since I was 15, a small operation run by a woman named Diane Walsh, who had left a magazine editing career to write honestly about food in her city. Diane was 47. She had a desk covered in paper clips organized by size, and a habit of editing with a red pen that she pressed into the page with a specific weight that I can still feel if I think about it. She had been doing this for 22 years, and she was still learning, she said, which was the only reason to keep going. She handed me a red pen on my first day. She said, "This is how we think. On the page, in the margins, in the space between what was written and what was meant." I took that pen home. I still have it. The internship became a part-time job. The part-time job became the thing I organized the rest of my life around. By the time I went to university for journalism, Diane had written me a recommendation letter that said things about me I wouldn't have dared say about myself. My parents thought it was a phase. My father said, "You'll come back to the restaurant after university. You'll understand what this is." I said, "I think I understand what it is now." He said, "You understand it from the outside." He meant it as a correction. Looking back now, he meant it as a warning I didn't hear. At 22, I was hired as a junior writer at Meridian magazine. Lifestyle, food, culture, travel. A publication my mother had a copy of in the restaurant waiting area, which she pointed out once with a pride that was real and separate from the pride she wanted me to come home with. At 24, I was made a senior writer. At 25, I was nominated for an industry award for a piece I'd written about immigrant family restaurants in American cities. The piece was 3,200 words. It was one of the best things I'd done. My father had read it. He hadn't told me. I found out from Nana Pack, who said, "Your father cried reading it." He hadn't called me. At 26, the editor-in-chief offered me the features editor position. I had been waiting for the right time to tell my parents. The right time never came. 3 weeks after the offer, my parents called a family meeting, and I realized the right time had been now all along. The call came on a Thursday morning. My mother. Her voice had a particular quality to it. Prepared, rehearsed, the voice she used for things she had discussed with my father beforehand. She said, "Anna, we'd like to get the family together this Sunday. Your aunt's house. Just a family talk." I said, "About what?" She said, "The restaurant. The future. We want everyone together." I said, "Is everything okay?" She said, "We just need to talk as a family." I said, "Okay." I didn't press. I should have pressed. Because what happened when I walked into Aunt Jean's living room on Sunday afternoon was not a family conversation about the restaurant's future. It was an intervention. 11 members of my extended family arranged in a semicircle of living room chairs, with one chair placed in the center, facing them. The empty chair was for me. I want to tell you what I understood in the 30 seconds between walking through that door and sitting in that chair. I understood that this had been planned. I understood it by the specific way certain aunts wouldn't meet my eyes. By the way, my cousin Kevin, who was 29 and the family's perpetual diplomat, had taken a position near the door where he could get to me quickly if needed. And by the folder on my father's knee. Tan cardboard. Papers inside. The kind of folder you bring when you've organized your argument in advance. I sat down in the empty chair. I set my bag on the floor beside me. My father cleared his throat. He said, "Anna, we've been talking. Your mother and I, and the family. And we've come to a decision that we want to share with you." He said it the way he said everything important, measured, precise, the voice he used for vendor negotiations and lease renewals. He said, "The restaurant needs someone here. James has his life with Sarah and the baby in Portland. We understand that. We're not asking him. But you." He paused. "You're still establishing yourself. You have time to build something here. Real security. Family security." My mother said, "We're not asking you to give up writing. You could help manage the restaurant and still write on the side." The side. The position I'd been offered was features editor of Meridian magazine. A role that in this industry requires 12-hour days and the kind of full attention that cannot coexist with the side. My Aunt Rose said, "Anna, family is what lasts. These magazine jobs, they can disappear tomorrow." I looked at my aunt. She had been told something. I could hear it in the specificity of these magazine jobs. In the way she said disappear like she believed it was already happening. After the meeting, when I drove home, I called my brother. I said, "James, what have Mom and Dad been telling people about my job?" He was quiet for a moment. He said, "They mentioned something about cutbacks at the magazine. Those things were uncertain." I said, "There are no cutbacks." He was quiet. I said, "I was promoted 3 weeks ago." He said, "What?" I said, "Features editor. I haven't announced it yet." He said, "Jess." "Anna," I said. "My name is Anna." He said, "I know, sorry. Anna. They told everyone your job was unstable, that you were worried about your position." I said, "I have never said that to them, ever." The line went quiet. He said, "I didn't know." I said, "I know." I hung up. Sat in my car outside my apartment building for a long time. My parents had called a family meeting to pressure me to quit my job. And they had primed 11 people in advance with a story, a manufactured story about instability and uncertainty, to make the pressure feel like concern. That wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found when I called Diane. Diane had taken a call from my father. I found out when I mentioned the family meeting gig, and she said, "Is this about the conversation he had with me?" I said, "What conversation?" She said, "Your father called our main line about 3 weeks ago. He asked to speak with my assistant. He said he was doing a reference check on an employee named Anna Park who had applied for a position at another company." I stared at my kitchen wall. She said, "Our assistant said we couldn't confirm employment details via a cold call." He thanked her and hung up. She said, "I didn't tell you because I didn't want to alarm you before I knew what it meant. Now we both knew what it meant. My father had tried to access my employment information under pretenses. Not because he was suspicious of me, because he was building a case. He wanted to know how secure my job was so he could frame the conversation at the family meeting with precise language. And Diane's assistant had told him nothing, so he had filled in the gap himself, with the story that served him best." I said, "Diane, I'm going to need a few days before I give my answer on the promotion." She said, "Take what you need." I said, There's a family situation I have to handle first. She said, Anna. I waited. She said, you know what you want. You've known since you were 22. I said, I know. She said, then go handle the family situation. I said, I will. I did not call my parents that evening. I did not call them the following day. I sat with everything I knew, the family meeting, the story they had told, the call to Diane's office, and I thought about what I was going to do with it. There is a specific discipline in journalism that Diane taught me early. She called it the delay. She said, between what happens and what you write, there is always a gap. That gap is where the truth lies. If you close it too fast, you get a reaction. If you hold it long enough, you get clarity. I held it for 4 days. On the first day, I read the promotion letter again. It was 2 pages, formal letterhead, the editor-in-chief's signature in blue ink. It outlined the role, the responsibilities, the salary, $87,000 annually, plus benefits, plus a travel budget that would have made 22-year-old me faint outright. On the second day, I called James. Not to strategize, just to talk. He said, I should have told you what they were saying to people. I said, you should have. He said, I thought it was just parent worry. I didn't think they'd turn it into something official. I said, it became official when they seated me in an intervention chair. He was quiet. He said, what are you going to do? I said, I'm going to answer them, clearly. He said, do you want me to be there? I thought about that. I said, yes. Call Mom and ask if we can have another family meeting. Just us and the immediate family. Tell her you want to be part of the conversation. He said, okay. He called me back an hour later. He said, they're suggesting Sunday. Same aunt's house. I said, of course they are. He said, Anna, are you all right? I said, I'm very clear. I called my mentor, Nana Pack, on the 3rd day. Not my formal mentor, my grandmother. She answered on the 2nd ring, as she always does. I told her what happened. The meeting. The story they told. The call to Diane's office. The promotion. She listened without speaking. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in Korean, that I understood better than I spoke, your father built something with his hands because his hands were what he had. He thinks building is always done with hands. I said, he doesn't understand that this is a building, she said. Show him. He can see what he can see. She paused. She said, and Anna, don't be angry when you show him. Anger is loud. Loud is noise. Quiet is where the truth lands. I said, I know. She said, I know you know. The promotion letter was in an envelope in my bag. It had been there since the morning Diane handed it to me. I had not taken it out since I read it. On the 4th day, I got a call from my mother. She said, Anna, we're concerned you haven't called. I said, I've been thinking. She said, we miss you. We just want you to be safe. You understand that, right? I said, I'll see you Sunday. She said, bring what you need. She meant, bring your agreement. I brought something else. If you've ever been asked to walk into a room knowing you're the subject of a decision that was made without you, if you know what it means to have to be calm when every part of you isn't, type enough in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed, now is the time. Sunday is coming. Saturday. The day before the 2nd meeting, my mother called twice. I answered once. She said, I want you to come in with an open mind. I said, I always have an open mind. She said, your father has some figures to show you about what the restaurant could pay if you came on as manager. It's actually more than you might think. I said, how much? She said, $42,000 to start, plus equity in the business eventually. I said, okay. She said, is that something you'd consider? I said, I'll see you tomorrow, Mom. She said, Anna? I said, I'll be there. I hung up. $42,000. The promotion was $87,000. That was the gap between the life they imagined for me and the life I had actually built. Not a personal gap, not a values gap. A real, measurable, documented gap between 2 numbers on 2 different pieces of paper. My father called at 9:30 that evening. He said, Anna, I want to explain something before tomorrow. I said, okay. He said, what we're offering isn't just money. It's stability. It's family. It's something that lasts beyond one magazine or one editor. I said, I understand what you're offering. He said, do you? I said, yes, Dad. He said, your mother and I didn't build this for it to pass out of the family. I said, I know. He said, then come home. 2 words. The full sentence of what this had always been. I said, I'll see you tomorrow. I went to find the red pen. It was in the drawer of my desk, where it had been for 4 years. The first red pen Diane had given me. The cap slightly cracked from years of clicking. The ink barely shows because I never write with it. I just keep it. I put it in the inside pocket of my jacket. Then I went to get the promotion letter from my bag. I read it one more time. I put it back in the cream envelope. I set the envelope on the corner of my desk where I would see it in the morning. Then I went to bed. I couldn't sleep. Midnight. My apartment. The quiet specific to a city at that hour. Not silent, just distant. I got up and sat at my desk. The envelope was there. I picked it up, held it without opening it. I'd read it enough. I knew every line. I thought about my father at 24, arriving with a culinary school diploma and a waterproof recipe book. Building something from nothing in a city he was still learning. Saturdays at the prep table. Sunday evening silver. 20 years of the specific smell of the kitchen at 5 o'clock. He had built something real, and he thought what I was doing was not real. Not because he didn't respect it, because he didn't understand that what I did was also built. Every byline, every red pen draft, every 3,200-word story about immigrant family restaurants that he had read and cried over without telling me. He understood what I said when I wrote it. He didn't understand that writing it was the same as building. The tears came without warning. Not a collapse. A quiet overflow I let happen at my desk at midnight, with the city noise distant and the envelope in my hands. I cried because I had wanted this to be simple. I had wanted to call my parents 3 weeks ago and say, I got the promotion, and have them say, we're so proud, and have it be true in the way it looked. I had wanted, still, a version of my family where love and understanding were the same thing. But they weren't. And the gap between them was the conversation I had to have tomorrow. I wiped my face. Picked up the red pen from my jacket pocket. Held both, the pen and the letter. The beginning and the thing it had built toward. Then I put the pen back in my jacket. The letters are in my bag, went to bed. Set my alarm. If someone who believed in your work ever handed you something small, a tool, a note, a gesture, that became the thing you carried through everything after. Tell me in the comments. I want to hear it. And now let me tell you what happened in that room. Sunday, 11:47 in the morning. Aunt Jean's living room, same room. Fewer people this time. My parents, James and his wife Sarah on video call from Portland, my aunt, and me. No intervention semicircle. But the tan folder was on my father's knee again. My mother had made tea that nobody touched. My father waited until everyone was settled. Then he opened the folder. He said, I want to go through some numbers with you. He placed a single page on the coffee table. Typed, organized. The restaurant's projected income with my salary, added as manager. The rent comparison between my apartment in the city and what I could have locally. The equity structure. Year by year, up to 5 years. He had prepared this. He was not a man who prepared things carelessly. I looked at the numbers. I let him walk through them. When he finished, he looked at me. He said, what do you think? I said, I think you've worked very hard on this. He nodded. He heard agreement. I said, I also think you called Diane's office 3 weeks ago. The room shifted. He said, I wanted to understand your situation. I said, you identified yourself as doing a reference check for a position Anna Park had applied for. That wasn't true. He said, I needed to understand. I said, you could have asked me. He said, you never tell us anything about your work. I said, that's not accurate. I tell you what I publish. You read what I write. He looked at the folder. I said, you also told the family I was unstable, that my position was uncertain. You told 11 people that before you brought me into a room where you were going to offer me a solution to a problem I didn't have. My mother said, we were worried. I said, you manufactured a reason to worry. The room was very quiet. James, on the video screen, had his hand over his mouth. My aunt looked at the tablecloth. I reached into my bag, the cream envelope. I placed it on the coffee table beside my father's folder. 2 documents, side by side. I said, This is a letter from the editor-in-chief of Meridian magazine. It was offered to me 3 weeks ago. I have been waiting for the right time to tell you. My father looked at the envelope. He didn't touch it. I said, "Features editor. It is the role I have been working toward for 4 years. The salary is $87,000. My mother pressed her hand flat on the arm of her chair. I said, "I'm telling you this not to make your offer look small. You built something real. I know what that required. I know what it costs." I looked at my father. I said, "I'm telling you because I also built something real. And I need you to understand that before you ask me to leave it." My father picked up the envelope. He held it without opening it. I said, "Open it." He opened it. He read the first page. Then the second. The room held a specific kind of silence. Not the silence of people not speaking. The silence of people not moving. When he finished, he set the letter down. He did not look at me immediately. He looked at the letter, at the editor-in-chief's signature, at the salary line, at the title in bold at the top of the first page, Features Editor. He read that part again. Then he looked at me. And I saw, for the first time in this conversation, for the first time in longer than this conversation, his face without any of the performance. Without the fold, the figures, and the prepared argument. Just my father, reading something about me that he hadn't known. He said, "Why didn't you tell us?" I said, "Because I was afraid you'd use it as a reason to let me go." The consequences came slowly, quietly, not in dominoes, more like the weather that changes gradually, and then all at once, when you notice the temperature is different. My father sat with the letter for a long time before he put it down. Then he said, "I called their office." I said, "I know." He said, "That was wrong." It wasn't a question. It wasn't an explanation. It was a statement he made like a man reading something off a ledger, accurate and without embellishment. I said, "Yes." He said, "And the family meeting. What we told people." I said, "Yes." He said that was also wrong. My mother said, "Richard." He said, "Helen, it was wrong. We told people she was struggling when she wasn't. We wanted the meeting to succeed, and we set it up to succeed by telling people things that weren't true." His voice was even. He was not performing contrition. He was applying the same precise attention he applied to vendor negotiations and lease renewals. Something had been done incorrectly. He was naming it. That was the most my father had ever said in that register about something I was involved in. My aunt left the room to get more tea that nobody wanted. James said, from the screen, "Mom, Dad. For the record, Sarah and I supported Anna's career from the beginning. I should have said that more clearly over the years." My mother started crying. Not the performative kind, the quiet kind, the kind that happens when you have been holding something at a specific angle for a long time and your arms finally give out. She said, "We just wanted you home." I said, "I know." She said, "We've been so scared. About the restaurant. About your father's heart. About what happens if everything just—" She stopped. I said, "I know, Mom." I said, "Here's what I want to offer you." They both looked at me. I said, "I can't manage the restaurant. That's not negotiable. But I can help you find someone who can. I know this industry. I know food people. I can write something, a profile of Park Family Kitchen, that gets it the attention it hasn't had." My father said, "A profile?" I said, "A real one. The kind I write. Not a promotional piece. A story about what you built and what it means." He said, "In Meridian?" I said, "I'm going to be features editor, Dad. I assign the stories now." Something moved across his face. Not pride exactly. Something adjacent to it. The recognition of a thing being real that he hadn't let himself fully believe was real. He said, "That's a serious position." I said, "Yes." He said, "And you've been—" His voice changed. "Quieter? This is what you've been building." I said, "Yes, for 4 years." He picked up the letter again, not to read, just to hold. The way you hold a thing when you're understanding it differently than you did the first time. My mother said, "You read your piece about the restaurants, the one about immigrant families." She was crying. "He didn't tell you, but he read it 3 times. I said, "Nana Pack told me." She said, "He kept the print copy." My father did not deny this. He set the letter down. He said, "I didn't understand what you were doing." I said, I know, he said. I do now. One sentence. It was enough. The profile of Park Family Kitchen ran in Meridian 6 months after I accepted the features editor position. 3,000 words, full editorial photography. A story about my father arriving at 24 with a diploma and a waterproof recipe book. About my mother learning the neighborhood. About what it means to build something with your hands in a city that has never stopped changing. The piece ran in the food and culture section. It was shared 11,000 times in the first week. 2 restaurant publications picked it up. A food critic from a national paper came for dinner and wrote about the experience on his blog. The restaurant had its best quarter in 4 years. My father called me when the numbers came in. He said, "The story." I said, "Yes." He said, "You gave us something." I said, "I wrote what was true." He said, "That's what you've always done." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I called Diane's office. I shouldn't have." I said, "You already said that, Dad." He said, "I'm saying it again, because you're right that I could have asked you. I knew I could. I chose not to. I think because I was afraid of the answer." I said, "I understand that." He said, I don't think I understood that you were afraid too." I said, "I was afraid you wouldn't be proud." He said, "I'm reading the piece again right now." He was reading the profile. On his phone, at his restaurant, in the middle of a Tuesday morning. He said, "You wrote about the recipe book?" I said, "Yes." He said, "How did you know about the waterproof sleeve?" I said, "Nana Pack told me." He was quiet. He said, "You paid attention." I said, "I always paid attention." He said, "I know. I see that now." My mother came to visit me in the city 3 months after the profile ran. She stayed for a weekend. We walked places I hadn't shown her before. She asked about the magazine, about the team, about what the features editor meant day to day. Real questions, with listening behind them. On Sunday morning, over coffee in my apartment, she said, "I want you to know something. When we planned that meeting at Aunt Jean's, I knew it wasn't right. I agreed to it because your father was scared, and I didn't know how else to help him." I said, "I know." She said, "I should have said something to you sooner. Before the meeting. Directly." I said, "Yes." She said, "That's on me." I said, "It's on both of you." She nodded. She said, "We're working on it." I believe her. Not because I have proof of the new version yet, because I've seen the beginning of it. The phone calls are longer. The questions that are real. My father read the profile 3 times. My mother is sitting across from me at my apartment on a Sunday morning, saying the true thing instead of the managed thing. The beginning is real. That's what I know so far. On my desk, in my office at Meridian, the office with the glass wall and the view of the street below, there is a red pen and a pencil cup. Diane gave it to me on my first day as features editor. A new one, fresh ink. Inside the cap, in her handwriting, "Edit everything twice. The second time for what you actually meant. I keep it there. Not to write with. Just to remember where the thing began. It's a Tuesday in March. Early morning. The city is still in that particular quiet before the commuter rush. I'm at my desk. Coffee is getting warm beside me. The red pen in its cup. The view of the street below, where the light comes in at an angle that will be different in 40 minutes. I've been thinking about what my father said. You paid attention. He meant it as an observation, but I've been sitting with it as something else. As the whole story, really, in 4 words. I grew up in a restaurant where everything was watched, where the size of the vegetable mattered, where the heat of the wok had to be right, where my father pressed his thumb into wood to check for soft spots, and my grandmother shelled peas with the precision of someone who knew exactly how many she needed. I learned attention there. I just applied it differently than they expected. Writing is attention. That's what it is, stripped of everything else. Paying attention to what's actually happening instead of what you assumed was happening. Asking the right question, not the comfortable one, not the one that confirms what you already believe, the actual question. And then staying with the answer long enough to understand it. My parents planned a meeting to make me smaller because they didn't understand that I had been building. And the thing that changed the meeting wasn't anger, wasn't a speech, wasn't even the salary number. It was a document. Evidence that I had been doing something real in the time they weren't watching, with the attention they'd taught me. They taught me to pay attention. They were surprised that I'd used it. They shouldn't have been surprised. I didn't win against my parents. There's no winning when the people who underestimate you are the people who love you. when their fear and their love have gotten so tangled that they can't tell one from the other. You don't get back the years of smaller assumptions. You don't know the meeting that was planned without you. But you get the conversation on the other side. The one where your father says, "I didn't understand what you were building," and you say, "I know." And that's the beginning of something smaller and more honest than what you'd hoped for when you were 22, and larger in its way than anything you dare say out loud. My grandmother said, "Your eyes go somewhere else." She was right. They went here. And here, it turns out, is exactly where I was supposed to be. One red pen, one desk, one view of the street below. It's enough. Has someone ever asked you to abandon the thing you were in the middle of building because they couldn't see the building yet? Tell me in the comments. I read everyone. Type "build" in the comments if this story landed with you. Subscribe and hit the bell. A new story every day. Check the description for more stories like this one. I'll see you tomorrow.